Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
I remember that night like it was yesterday, even though I wish I could forget it entirely because it brought back every single thing I had been trying to bury for years. But at the same time, it was the moment I realized that nothing I had done or would do could ever earn the respect I deserved from my mother, and that's why when she raised her voice across the living room crowded with family and friends, I didn't flinch, I didn't argue. And I didn't even try to explain myself because I had learned a long time ago that any explanation from me was met with ridicule or worse, silence that was somehow heavier than any insult she could throw. She pointed at me with that familiar mix of anger and smugness that she always used. The kind of look that said she had been thinking about this moment for hours, carefully rehearsing the words she wanted to wound me with the precision of someone who believed emotional pain was her currency, and she said loud enough for everyone within earshot to "Here, I owe you nothing. You're worthless." The words landed like a punch, but strangely, they didn't surprise me, and they didn't make me cry the way they might have when I was younger, because I had spent years preparing for the possibility that she would never see me as an equal, never recognize the hours I had spent working, the sacrifices I had made to avoid being a burden, and the endless attempts to win her approval that had been consistently met with dismissal or derision. So I simply sipped my drink slowly, letting the tension hang in the air for just a second longer than necessary, and then I smiled, deliberately calm, and looked her straight in the eye, because this time I wasn't going to react out of fear or desperation. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing me crumble in front of everyone I had to pretend to care about, and I said, as clearly and firmly as I could, "That's fine. I just wanted to announce that I'm moving abroad permanently." The room went silent in a way that made me almost giddy inside, because all at once, the conversation shifted from her to me, and I could see the expressions on the faces of my relatives, a mixture of shock, confusion, and the faintest trace of amusement that quickly disappeared as they realized I wasn't joking, I wasn't seeking attention, and I wasn't asking for permission, because I had spent months planning this move, lining up every detail in secret, saving money, handling paperwork, and making sure that every step I took was one she couldn't control, influence, or sabotage, and the truth hit her harder than anything I could ever say verbally because it wasn't just words, it was action, it was a fact she couldn't deny. And she realized in that moment that I had already won the first round of what she had always believed would be a fight she could dictate. She laughed at first, that high, sharp laugh that always sounded like it was meant to humiliate me rather than express amusement, and I could see her eyes darting to my father and brother, probably hoping they would intervene, shame me, or talk me down. But there was no intervention, there was only my calm, unshakable certainty, and I kept smiling, because for the first time, the truth was entirely on my side, and she had no words that could undo what I had already accomplished quietly, deliberately, and without fanfare for months leading up to this moment, and as the laughter faded, the tension in the room thickened until everyone could feel the shift, the change in dynamics, the unmistakable realization that this time, she didn't have control, and that control was the very thing she thrived on, the thing that had always defined her relationship with me. I didn't need to explain why I was moving, I didn't need to justify my career choices, my independence, or my life plan, because none of it had ever mattered to her anyway, and by simply stating the fact that I was leaving permanently, I took away the only weapon she had left, which was the ability to embarrass me publicly, and I could see the panic beginning to flicker across her face, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but enough for me to notice and feel a thrill of satisfaction. Because I had spent years building my life quietly, under the radar, ensuring that when the moment came, I could strike back without even lifting a finger, and that moment had finally arrived in a way she could not ignore, cannot reverse, and cannot erase. The party continued, but everything had shifted. The conversations that had been about trivial matters or small talk now had an undercurrent of tension, because everyone knew something had changed. They could see the victory in my composure. And I could feel the power in simply walking through the room without arguing, without begging for recognition, and without letting her words pierce me as they once had, and as I sipped my drink again, I realized that this was only the beginning, that the real revenge wasn't just in moving abroad, it was in showing her, subtly, cleverly, and undeniably, that I had become someone she could not manipulate, control, or diminish, and in that moment, I allowed myself a small, private smile. Knowing that the first blow had landed perfectly, and that she was finally, for the first time in her life, not laughing. After the party, I went home and let the adrenaline fade, but the satisfaction lingered because for the first time in years, I had felt entirely untouchable, and I knew that keeping it that way would require more than one bold declaration. It would require careful planning, patience, and a willingness to let my mother and everyone around me underestimate what I was capable of while I quietly built a life they could not control or influence, because the truth was that my independence had been months in the making, with every decision meticulously calculated to ensure that when I finally revealed the full scope of what I had achieved, it would hit with undeniable impact and leave no room for manipulation or interference. And that meant making sure that every financial, professional, and personal move I made was invisible until the moment it would matter most. I started by reviewing my bank accounts, which had always been a battleground because my mother believed that access to my finances meant power over me, and I methodically separated every account, creating new ones under my own name and ensuring that nothing I had saved could be touched without my explicit approval, all the while maintaining the appearance that I was still tied to the family. Because the last thing I wanted was for her to sense my independence too soon, which would only give her a chance to sabotage, guilt-trip, or manipulate me, and I knew that patience was my greatest advantage, so I spent hours on the phone with financial advisors, meticulously checking paperwork, updating information, and making sure that when the time came, there would be no leverage she could use against me. At work, I doubled down on my projects, not because I wanted recognition in the conventional sense, but because I knew that the success I quietly built would eventually serve as a form of revenge far more satisfying than any confrontation. While my mother had always dismissed my accomplishments or spoken of them as if they were trivial, I used every opportunity to position myself strategically, taking on challenges that allowed me to quietly demonstrate my confidence, earn promotions that were not just a reflection of my abilities, but a direct counterpoint to her constant insistence that I was incapable, and I made sure that my successes were documented, undeniable, and untouchable, knowing that when the moment came to reveal them, they would speak louder than any argument or insult could. I also began preparing the logistics of my move, choosing a city abroad where I could establish myself without interference, researching neighborhoods, schools, healthcare, and transportation. Because the idea of freedom was meaningless without security and stability, and I wanted every detail covered so that the announcement of my departure would carry weight not just emotionally, but practically, proving that I had not acted on impulse, but with a careful, methodical plan that ensured I could thrive completely independent of the family that had repeatedly tried to control me, and as I arranged for housing, set up international banking, and coordinated professional contacts, I felt a growing sense of empowerment that I had never experienced before because every small action was a step toward liberation and toward finally proving to my mother that her power over me was an illusion. Meanwhile, she called frequently, leaving messages filled with anger, guilt, and thinly veiled attempts at manipulation, claiming that I was being selfish, that I didn't understand family obligations, and that she would be devastated if I left. And each time I listened, I responded with the same calm firmness that had served me at the party, sometimes declining to answer directly, sometimes simply saying that my decision had been made, that it was final, and that I had considered all consequences, and in every interaction, I could feel her frustration growing because she was accustomed to controlling the narrative, but now the narrative was mine, and no amount of pleading or shouting could change the course I had set for myself, which only made the eventual reveal of my independence even more satisfying because it was impossible to argue against facts that were already established. I also confided in Lisa, my best friend, who became my sounding board and my ally in subtle maneuvers, helping me strategize how to communicate my plans without triggering panic or sabotage, and we plotted ways to manage family interactions, craft messages that revealed just enough to unsettle my mother while keeping the full scope of my independence hidden, and we even rehearsed scenarios where she might attempt to pull strings at the last moment, preparing my responses so that no matter what she said, I could maintain composure and ensure that her attempts at control would fail entirely, and every time I thought about her face the night of the party, I felt a quiet, growing satisfaction knowing that the first psychological blow was already delivered, and that the next rounds would be even more precise, subtle, and devastating. By the time the week was over, I had completely reorganized my life in a way that my mother could not touch, could not predict, and could not undermine. And I realized that the satisfaction of planning and preparation was even sweeter than the thrill of confrontation because every step I had taken quietly reinforced the fact that I was no longer a passive participant in my life, and that when the moment came to fully reveal my independence, my mother would have no choice but to face the reality that her control had ended permanently, and I allowed myself to imagine that moment repeatedly, savoring the thought of her shock and the undeniable proof that I had finally become untouchable. Over the next few weeks, I started to notice the subtle cracks appearing in the carefully constructed persona my mother had always relied on to dominate every family interaction, and it was not because I was doing anything overtly confrontational, but because I had learned that real power often lies in restraint and in letting others reveal themselves. So I made sure that every conversation, every interaction, and every casual update I gave her was loaded with truth in a way she could not control, while appearing entirely innocuous, and I watched as her confidence, once so impenetrable and sharp, began to waver in the face of evidence that I was no longer the child who could be dismissed or manipulated. And that realization made each interaction quietly thrilling because I knew she was starting to panic in ways that were subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but entirely visible to me. I began taking more concrete steps toward my move, sending in applications for positions abroad, completing paperwork, and booking appointments with relocation agencies, but I was careful to do everything under the radar, ensuring that the full picture was not available to anyone except myself and Lisa, my ally, who was endlessly practical and incredibly precise in helping me manage the details so that nothing could go wrong, and I knew that this secrecy was critical, because any premature awareness from my mother would trigger attempts at sabotage, manipulation, or guilt, all of which had been her preferred methods for decades, and I was determined to eliminate any opportunity for her to interfere, knowing that the ultimate satisfaction would come not just from leaving, but from the undeniable evidence that my independence was real, fully planned, and completely untouchable. Meanwhile, she started sending passive-aggressive messages, thinly veiled attempts to guilt me into reconsidering, mentioning family obligations, her disappointment, and the emotional consequences of my decisions, and I responded with measured calm, never raising my voice or appearing flustered, because I had realized that her power was directly tied to my reactions, and by maintaining composure, I slowly began to shift the balance of influence in my favor, and each message I ignored or responded to in the most neutral, factual way only increased her frustration, which was deeply satisfying because she had spent years attempting to provoke me into submission, and now, finally, she had nothing she could say that would impact my choices, my plans, or my sense of self-worth, which had been meticulously rebuilt over months of quiet preparation. During family gatherings, I carefully controlled every interaction, choosing my words in ways that communicated confidence, independence, and a lack of dependency without appearing to gloat or provoke. And I noticed that my mother's attempts to dominate conversations, make cutting remarks, or assert superiority were increasingly ineffective because the audience around her, my relatives who had previously been quick to side with her, now began to perceive the imbalance, noticing the subtle tension and realizing that I was no longer the same person they had dismissed or underestimated, and that realization alone was beginning to isolate her in a way that made her frustration almost palpable, and I could not help but feel a quiet, steady satisfaction knowing that her authority, carefully maintained for decades, was beginning to crumble without a single overt confrontation. I also began planting small, deliberate hints that my move abroad was imminent, carefully calibrated to create anticipation without revealing full details, mentioning casually that I had considered opportunities in other countries, that certain professional contacts were asking me to relocate, and that life was shifting in ways that would require a major decision on my part, and I watched her reaction to each statement, noticing the tension that flickered across her face, the way her tone became slightly sharper, her eyes darting in subtle panic, and I realized that my strategic patience was working perfectly because she had no idea how serious or final my plans were. And that uncertainty was far more torturous for her than a simple confrontation would have been, and it only reinforced my belief that true revenge was always most satisfying when it unfolded quietly, inexorably, and with perfect timing. As the days passed, I felt my confidence grow alongside the realization that I had finally created a situation where my mother's power was meaningless, and even though she attempted small manipulations, subtle questions about my plans, or veiled criticisms of my choices, I handled each one with calm, deliberate control, never allowing her to provoke an emotional reaction, and with each interaction, I could sense the quiet unraveling of her carefully maintained authority, knowing that the ultimate satisfaction would not come from a single dramatic confrontation, but from the cumulative impact of months of strategic planning, patient execution, and the simple, undeniable fact that I was entirely in control of my own life. And she had no ability to influence, intimidate, or manipulate me anymore, and that knowledge gave me a sense of triumph that was as deeply satisfying as it was quietly devastating to her. The day I had been meticulously preparing for finally arrived, and it was not marked by any dramatic confrontation or visible announcement, but rather by a sequence of carefully orchestrated events that would force my mother to confront the reality she had spent decades denying, undermining, and attempting to control. And I knew that every small detail mattered because the impact would be measured not just by her reaction in that moment, but by the undeniable proof that my life was now entirely mine, and that her influence, authority, and manipulative tactics were completely powerless against the structure I had built in secrecy over months of patient, deliberate effort, which had required not only strategic planning, meticulous attention to detail, and emotional control, but also an almost ruthless commitment to remaining calm, measured, and untouchable while allowing her to unknowingly walk into the culmination of my independence. I began the day by sending carefully worded messages to close family members and friends, subtly dropping hints that I had finalized critical steps in my relocation process, all while presenting them as casual updates, which allowed me to gauge reactions without alerting my mother to the full scope of my plans, and the responses I received confirmed that the information was reaching the right people and generating the intended anticipation, curiosity, and quiet admiration for the choices I had made, and I felt a growing sense of satisfaction knowing that every small move had been calibrated to build pressure, generate awareness, and set the stage for the ultimate revelation that would leave my mother without a single avenue to assert control, defend her position, or manipulate the narrative in her favor, because the evidence would be clear, undeniable, and unassailable. When I arrived at the family gathering later that evening, I carried myself with a calm, confident demeanor that communicated ownership over my life without appearing to boast, and I watched closely as my mother attempted her usual tactics, sarcasm, belittlement, and thinly veiled insults, but each word she spoke bounced off me, ineffective and irrelevant, because my preparation had rendered her power null and void, and I allowed her to speak, nodding politely and answering neutrally, which only intensified her frustration and created a visible tension that the other attendees could not ignore, because for the first time, my composure, confidence, and independence contrasted sharply with her attempts to assert dominance, making her increasingly isolated, defensive, and desperate for control, which was exactly the psychological shift I had been aiming for with my months of quiet, deliberate planning. Once the initial tension had settled, I casually raised a glass and addressed the room, not with anger or confrontation, but with calm authority, announcing that after years of consideration, planning, and careful preparation, I would be moving abroad permanently, and I laid out the key details, including the city, the professional opportunities, and the practical arrangements that had been finalized behind the scenes. And I emphasized that this was not a decision made impulsively, but a deliberate and inevitable step in my pursuit of independence and personal fulfillment, and I watched as my mother's confident, dismissive expression crumbled, her eyes widening, her voice faltering, and her carefully maintained composure giving way to visible shock, disbelief, and a growing panic that was impossible to mask. The room immediately shifted in atmosphere, and I could feel the weight of attention focusing on her as the other family members, many of whom had previously taken her side unquestioningly, began to grasp the full scale of my independence. Realizing that her habitual control, manipulation, and belittlement had no bearing on my ability to build a successful, autonomous life, and the knowledge that they were witnessing her powerless reaction gave me a profound, quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with malice, but everything to do with finally reclaiming the narrative, asserting authority over my own life, and demonstrating in the clearest possible terms that her influence was no longer operative, while simultaneously leaving her scrambling to find words, explanations, or excuses, all of which fell short because the evidence I presented was unassailable. As she attempted to regain control, offering half-hearted protests and seeking sympathy, I remained unwavering, calmly reinforcing the facts, emphasizing the finality of my decision, and leaving no opportunity for manipulation, guilt, or argument, and I watched as her frustration intensified, her habitual verbal attacks losing potency, while the subtle, powerful shift in family perception became evident as relatives exchanged glances, whispered observations, and quiet admiration for the careful, disciplined way I had orchestrated this revelation, and in that moment, I felt a deep, satisfying sense of triumph because the culmination of months of patience, preparation, and strategy had delivered a result that was complete, undeniable, and permanently altering the dynamics of our relationship, leaving her stunned, disoriented, and, finally, confronted with the truth that I was no longer under her control. In the days after that gathering, when the air finally cleared and the reality of my decision started settling into the cracks of everyone's routines, I felt the first steady calm I had known in years. Not the fragile quiet that follows a fight and can be shattered by the next call or the next message, but a grounded calm that came from knowing I had constructed something durable and mine, and I realized that if I wanted this to hold, I needed one last move that would not just close the door, but bolt it from my side. So when my dad called me from an unknown number and asked if we could talk without any background noise or sudden interruptions, I listened carefully as he said he had watched the party spiral, had seen the way my mother panicked when she couldn't pull me back with the usual mix of shame and theatrics, and that he was tired of pretending it was normal, tired of rearranging his voice to make her feel bigger and me smaller. And if I was serious about leaving and staying gone, he wanted to help me do it in a way that protected both of us from the never-ending cycle that always drags everyone back in. We spoke for a long time in that hushed, practical way people fall into when there is finally something to build instead of something to survive, and I explained that I had already separated my finances, had already locked my credit, had already removed myself from anything that could be used as a leash, but that the real leverage in our family had never been money alone. It had been access and narrative, which meant that even with my bank accounts clean and my phone plan fully mine, there were still two things she could swing like a hammer if I let her, and those were the expectation that I would someday need something from her and the idea that she could still speak for me when I refused to show up. So we walked through concrete steps in plain language with no drama and no grand declarations, and by the end of the call we had a plan that fit together so neatly it felt like the kind of grown-up decision-making I had begged for as a kid and never got. Because grown-ups in our house only appeared when there was something to sign that benefited her. I hired a quiet, competent attorney who did not care about our family history and only cared about paperwork that holds up when emotions get loud, and together we drafted a straightforward no-contact letter that was not a threat or a performance, but a clear boundary with legal weight, delivered by certified mail to my mother and copied to anyone who had been used as a relay in the past, and it spelled out that communication could happen only through a single email address that would be monitored and archived, that any attempts to contact employers, landlords, friends, or extended relatives with claims about me would be documented and responded to by counsel, and that any debt she had ever alleged I owed was either paid in full or expired and would not be discussed again, and right below that, with my dad's quiet permission and a second signature witnessed in a beige office that cared only about dates and names, we executed a modest living trust for his benefit that placed his savings and future care decisions in the hands of an independent trustee with a simple instruction I drafted in the calmest words I could find, which said that his comfort, health, and dignity come first, and that no funds are to be released at the request of any family member who attempts to coerce, threaten, or bargain access to him against my presence, ensuring that the person who turned family into a tool no longer had a handle to grab. I know how this sounds to people who want tidy endings, and I know there are folks who will say that it is harsh to take steps that lock a door on your own mother. But the truth that rarely gets said out loud is that locking a door after years of voluntary fire drills is not cruelty, it is safety. And the day the letters were delivered, I felt my phone buzzing like a live wire with a dozen short messages that tried every angle she knows, starting with the dramatic plea and moving quickly to the insult, and then to the threat, and finally to the bargain. And for once I did not chase the attention or try to decode it. I simply archived the whole pile, let the attorney respond with 2 sentences and a citation, and turned my focus back to my move, which was no longer a plan or a dare or a test of will. It was a booked flight, a signed lease, a work contract with dates and deliverables, and a new phone number that only the people who use words for care and not control would ever see. I left quietly, with no goodbye tour and no back and forth about family obligations, because the obligation I recognize now is to the part of me that kept trying to negotiate with a person who viewed love as a scoreboard. And when my plane landed and I felt the immediate rush of logistics waiting for me, I did not post anything dramatic. I did not make a speech about fresh starts or healing. I simply got to work setting up a routine that did not involve monitoring someone else's mood like it was a weather report that could cancel my day, and in the evenings I sent my dad practical updates that made him smile, because they sounded like a person living, not a person testifying. And sometimes he sent me a line or two that said he was cooking for one and it was fine, and he was reading after dinner and it was quiet, and those little sentences did more for me than any apology could have. The final move happened a few weeks later, not with fireworks, but with the same simple precision that had kept me steady all year, when I wrote one email to the entire extended family that has been CC'd into our conflict for as long as I can remember. And I kept it short compared to everything I wanted to unload, telling them I had moved permanently, that I was doing well, that any stories about me should be checked with me directly through the address they now had, and that I would not be returning for holiday performances, meant to remind me where my seat used to be, and at the bottom I attached a quiet folder of receipts that were not designed to humiliate anyone, but to replace rumor with dates and totals, including proof of the small loans I had repaid years ago, the shared bills I had carried so no one's lights got cut, and the screenshot of the no-contact letter so they could see the boundary clearly instead of guessing and gossiping. And then I left the thread and muted the replies because my life is not a group chat and I do not need a chorus. My mother tried one last angle that night, a message that arrived through the only channel left to her, saying that I would regret this when the will is read and that I was walking away from more than money. I was walking away from a mother who had done her best. And I read it once without anger and without the old ache, because I had already stopped waiting for a new version of her to appear, and I replied with a single long paragraph that was the most honest thing I have ever sent, telling her that I do not measure family in inheritances or invitations, that I choose peace over points, that I will not attend any event where my worth is a punchline, and that the only door still open is the one where accountability walks in first and stays long enough to clean the room, after which I closed the laptop, looked around at a space that was entirely mine, and felt the satisfying click of a plan that had been about justice rather than cruelty, about clarity rather than drama, and while I know there will always be people who want a different ending, I also know that sometimes the most brilliant victory is not the dramatic win, but the quiet one that holds, and that is exactly what I built. Which is why when the next message arrived and the subject line was another attempt to pull me back into the game, I let it sit unopened and went on with my evening, certain for the first time that I had not just left, I had won.